Welcome to this keynote lecture. We're very happy and pleased, exhilarated to have Thomas here with us in the digital world, of course. I should mention from the very beginning, this event is part of the cooperation between oiip and the Ministry of Defense of Austria. Ministerium für Landesverteidigung. We do work for them in the sense of terrorism analysis, also in the area of jihadism and such events. Usually it's of course on site, but given the situation, we were doing this this time and this year online, which is of course of advantage for other people from other countries who can also join. There has been a lot of interest in this topic in Austria, of course, because of the recent events at the beginning of November. We also felt that there is a need for more information and founded information based on research, evidence-based, based on what is actually jihadism, what is global jihad, where is it coming from, and how can we really conceptualize it today, in the past, and in the future. Thomas here is an absolute expert on this topic, global jihad. Not only this, but also in the area of foreign fighters. I think you did actually pioneering work on analyzing the motivations and the movements of foreign fighters. And I'm just going to say a few things about you yourself, your profile. I was very impressed while reading it. Yeah, so Thomas is senior researcher at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment. And he has studied at the University of Oxford and Sciences Po in Paris, with fellowships at Harvard, Princeton, New York, and Stanford. Anything you left out? I don't think so. He has written a number of books, among which Al-Qaeda and Its Own Words, Jihad in Saudi Arabia, the Meccan Rebellion, Saudi Arabia in Transition, and of course my favorite, Jihadi Culture, the art and social practices of militant Islamists. And today he will talk to us from the perspective of his most recent book, in which he has researched on the biography of a very, I suppose, a hero in this area. I think it took about 10 years to research for it. I've seen reviews, it is extremely detailed. And we are very, yeah, here we go, the Caravan. It's actually not that expensive. Yeah, I checked for the massive size it has and the load of information. So anyway, we're very happy to have you, and we're going to have basically your presentation and then followed by questions. If you have questions, please just write them in the chat. You can write them anytime we collect them, and then I will address them to Thomas. All right, so here we go. Your floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniela. It's a real pleasure to be here, although it is in depressing circumstances in the wake of the tragic attack in Vienna. I've figured I would talk about the early history of the jihadi movement, because I am assuming that you've had a lot of kind of discussions in Austria about sort of the current situation, recent trends, why the state of jihadi networks in Austria, and so on and so forth. At least that's typically what happens in the wake of attacks like that. So what I wanted to do was kind of look further back and sort of ask the question, why is this phenomenon here in the first place? Why has it become a thing to have Sunni Islamist militants carrying out attacks in Europe? We've just been through sort of a wave of attacks in the mid 2010s, which was a very big wave in historical perspective, and before that there were also major attacks, of course, in the 2000s. So this has become a phenomenon in Europe, and although the past few years have seen a sharp decline in activity, the Vienna attack shows that the movement is still, it still has pulse. So this is a thing, but it wasn't a thing before. So there was no militant Islamist violence on European soil in the 80s or the 70s or the 60s. This is relatively new. So why did it emerge when it did? And before I move on, I need to say a few words, as the academic I am, about definitions. So I and others talk about, use the term jihadism or global jihadism, but people should be aware that this is an imprecise term which is highly debated and contentious. And in fact, almost all of the terms that we use when talking about this phenomenon are contested, and there aren't any perfect terms, and no one is suggesting that these terms are crystal clear or undisputed or anything. We have to realize that all these terms kind of have porous borders, and that there are people, there are well-informed intellectuals who have may have different definitions and so on. But still, I think over the years, a kind of intuitive sense of what sort of the term jihadism refers to has emerged, at least in the Western public sphere, and it connotes basically Sunni Islamist militants who operate across borders, basically the transnational Sunni Islamist militants, to be distinguished from Islamist militants who fight only within a limited area. For example, Hamas that fights in Palestine, or the Taliban that fights only inside of Afghanistan. So you may ask, why do we call this particular sort of transnational form of militancy jihadism, given that all these other groups also claim that they wage jihad and call themselves mujahideen? I mean, those are debates we can take in the Q&A that can go on forever. I think we just have to say that it's become a convention to refer to these militant Islamists who operate across borders and in the West as jihadis, and so in some sense we can specify, when you sometimes specify it further by saying global jihadis or transnational jihadis. There are kind of variations on a term. But we should be aware all the time that these transnational West-oriented jihadis are a small subset of a much larger universe of militant actors, and the vast majority of militant Islamists are not transnational, and they're not carrying out operations against Western targets. Is the transnational jihadi groups just tend to get a lot more attention because the international media is Western dominated, and the West cares about what happens there. So so we can think about this as a sort of almost like a pyramid, where the kind of the smallest subset is what we call kind of transnational jihadism on top, and it's part of a broader phenomenon of militant Islamism, which in turn is a subset of a larger phenomenon, again, that we can call Islamism. Now here again, people disagree about what Islamism is, and kind of in specific cases, whether a particular group or phenomenon sorts just on the inside or the outside of the definition, border definition. But broadly speaking, I think there's some kind of consensus around the notion that, you know, Islamists are political activists who expend effort to make society more Islamic, and this is to distinguish Islamists from Muslims, who are Muslims, by virtue of merely observing, what they view, as a regular practice of the religion. So, but Islamists are activists, so they do something more than simply observe regular practice. And what this more means can vary a lot, and it's also a spectrum. And if we think about this in terms of kind of tools or strategies, that there's we can distinguish between those Islamists that use violence and those that do not. So hence the term militant Islamists that would refer to all of these, to the whole family of groups, including sort of Al-Qaeda, IS, but also Hamas, Taliban, and other other groups that use violence on a regular basis. But there's also a whole class of actors that have renounced, that tend to renounce violence and that work towards the Islamization of society with peaceful means. And here, you have movements like the Muslim Brotherhood, or the so-called Salafi movement, although some people would argue that not all Salafis are necessarily that activist. So but that's another discussion again. But the point is, Islamism is a big tent, and is not necessarily sort of associated with violence. So what I'm interested in this talk is where this small subset of militants who are attacking, in the West, where they are coming from, where this phenomenon comes from. And I think just another sort of point of housekeeping before I go into the analysis is sort of just to get the facts established about when this about the phenomenon itself. And so basic question: when were the first Sunni Islamist attacks in the West? And basically, they were in the 90s, in the early 90s. In the 1980s, you actually had attacks in Europe by Shiite groups, but probably state-sponsored Shiite groups. But there was no Sunni Islamist violence in neither Europe or North America in the before 1990. Then in the early in 1990, late 1990, you get was probably the first incident, which is the killing of a kind of a far-right Jewish preacher called Meir Kahane in New York City, and it's an Egyptian former Afghan Arab, sort of a veteran of the, or actually I'm not sure if he personally had been. I think he had been, but he was certainly part of a circle in New York that had been in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And then you have in 1993, you have the big attack on the World Trade Center with the truck in the big parking lot there. And then you have major plot, and also in New York in 94, 95, which is called the New York Landmarks plot. And then if we move over to Europe, the first attacks start around 94, 95, although there are plots that in 93 that may have been the first incidents. but certainly kind of the people, date the beginning of, jihadism in Europe to, 94, 95. 94, if you include the hijacking of an Air France airplane in, that landed in Marseille airport and so on. But certainly in mid 1995, you have the series of bombings in France, especially the Saint-Michel bombing in July. So, and with a number of incidents in France and Belgium in 95, 96. Then it's a little bit quiet for a few years, and then in 2000 you start getting plots again, attack plots, and this time it's sort of connected to Al Qaeda that's now based in Afghanistan. And of course, from 2000, from 9/11 onwards, it's a different story. You get a lot more activity. At the same time, in the 1990s, you see the emergence of attacks against Western targets, in the Muslim world or in the Middle East. So although this is a slightly different, phenomenon from attacks in the West proper, they happen to coincide. So they're probably, symptoms of the same phenomena. You have a few attacks in the early 90s, and notably in Yemen. And then of course, you have in 1998 the big East Africa bombings orchestrated by Al Qaeda, the USS Cole attack in 2000, and so on. So the activity, basically, this operational activity, against Western targets in the region and attacks in the West, starts in the 1990s. Then the question becomes why? Why now? Why then? And before I move on, I also want to stress here that I am talking about the early origin of this phenomenon, not about its subsequent sort of rise and evolution. So I'm talking about the sort of the pre 9/11 phase, and I'm going to leave out the post 9/11 phase. And that's because I think the dynamics changed very much after 9/11, with notably with the United States and its allies taking a completely different, course of action in the Middle East, and launching invasions and increasing the military presence substantially, which I do think contributed to the rise of jihadism in the post 9/11 years. And so, but pre 9/11 is a different story, and I'm going to be arguing as a kind of hinted to in the abstract of the talk that I think we've overestimated the role of kind of Western foreign policy in the birth of this movement. But so we have to distinguish between the kind of the birth of the phenomenon and its subsequent kind of rise. And I'm talking here about the birth, and maybe we can go into the post 9/11 phase in the Q&A. So the sort of standard narrative of why this happened goes something like this, and I'm necessarily going to have to simplify, and I may, and I apologize in advance if it sounds Strawman-like, and I realize that people have written about this in a detailed and nuanced way, but I have to simplify here. Then I think the story is basically kind of has two steps. Step one is you get a big war in Afghanistan in the 1980s because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and Afghanistan becomes a destination for radical Islamists around the world, and becomes a crucible and kind of the cradle of new networks, transnational networks, Islamists from all over the world who come together and in their shared radicalism, and and they get fighting experience. They wind each other up. They get radicalized by the experience, and come out of the Afghanistan war as a as a transnational network that then goes out into the world. Once it's become difficult to be in Afghanistan proper, they go out into the world, to Bosnia, Chechnya, to Europe, etc., and then sort of become the seeds of new networks. And then and then step two of the story is that once this alumni network of Afghan Arab is out there, there's something new that happens, and that is the Gulf War of 1990, 1991, and where Iraq, where Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, and the US deploy troops to Saudi Arabia to protect Saudi territory and oil fields, because they fear that the Iraqi troops are going to go deeper into the Gulf. And the deployment of these troops come to be seen as a red sort of as a red flag for Islamists in the region, and particularly for some of these Arab Afghans, and most famously Osama bin Laden. So it's the deployment of US troops to Saudi Arabia in 1990 that motivates bin Laden to turn his attention to America, and to over the next few years develop a kind of a new doctrine, new ideology that's much more anti-Western. So the underlying kind of idea here is that it's basically the post-war, is the immediate sort of post-Cold War era. You have a very powerful United States that does things militarily in the Middle East that provokes a kind of reorientation or radicalization, if you will, of the kind of the ideology of some of these Afghan Arabs. And then you get in 96 the declaration of jihad against America by Osama bin Laden, and then in 1998 the declaration of jihad against the Jews and the Crusaders, all over the world, which is basically the sort of the green light from from the top of Al Qaeda to attack all kinds of targets, all kinds of Western targets all over the world. But the kind of the building blocks in this story is sort of the Afghan jihad, and then the Gulf War, and the deployment of US troops in the region, and and also an important part of the Afghan jihad element of the story is that, and this is in the sort of the conventional narrative, is that state support was very important for the rise of the Afghan Arab phenomenon. Now, if you'll recall, the sort of basic constellation in the Afghan jihad in the 1980s is that you have a communist Afghan regime in Kabul that is strongly supported by Soviet advisors and the Soviet military, and the Soviet military acts as the kind of the police force of this Afghan communist regime in Kabul. And this regime is at war with an alliance of insurgent groups, we call them the Mujahideen, who were Afghans, but of different different who opposed the communist regime, and who were more or less Islamist. There was a big kind of, there were a spectrum, and some of the, they were not all hardline Islamists, but some of them were. But anyway, you had this sort of this sort of this Afghan militant, Afghan insurgency against the Soviet occupation, and then states, and then Afghanistan becomes a sort of a scene of a proxy war between the US and the Soviet Union. The United States sees an opportunity to inflict damage on the Soviet Union by supporting the Afghan Mujahideen. And to sort of in the hope of inflicting a kind of a Vietnam on the Soviet Union, and the US does indeed support the Afghan Mujahideen with enormous resources, hundreds of millions of dollars, probably a few billions in total, in money and weaponry. And this is channeled mostly through through Pakistan or through Pakistani intelligence, and ends up in the hands of Afghan Mujahideen fighters. And the US is kind of support, and it has Saudi Arabia on its on board with the strategy, and so Saudi Arabia matches the US funding. The bottom line is that the states, and particularly US and Saudi Arabia, did they supported the Afghan jihad, and but in specifically the Afghan Mujahideen. Now, this has led to the sort of widespread view that kind of the Afghan Arabs who went there as foreign fighters were sort of necessarily almost a product of this sort of state, this sort of geopolitical game. But as I'll come back to, it's not. It's a bit more complicated than that. So this basic story about sort of this the Afghan jihad as a sort of major event of with geopolitical ramifications, and kind of state manipulation going on, and then the 90s with the Gulf War and the sort of the unipolarity and a very prominent and dominant United States. This is these are kind of the main building blocks, and they're largely they're largely true. I mean, there's very much to this, and these are indeed I think the building blocks of the story. The Afghan jihad certainly is crucial, as I show in my book. I mean, the leaders of most subsequent jihadi groups had almost all been to Afghanistan in the 1980s. So it really was a crucible. And also in the 1990s, the Gulf War and the deployment of US troops to Saudi Arabia was a motivating factor for bin Laden and Al Qaeda in the 90s. However, I think that this that this account and most of the variations of it is a little bit imprecise, and I think we now know more about this phase than we did before. But bear in mind that this this sort of standard account basically crystallized in the mid to late 2000s, when there was a massive sort of intellectual collective effort to try and understand 9/11 and what had happened, and there were some phenomenal books written at the time, and that were the best that could be produced at the time with the information that was available. However, as is usually the case with history and historical research, new information tends to sometimes resurfaces later, that sheds a new light on things, and that's happened to some degree in recent years, I think, where we have more information, a better view, more fine-grained view of what happened in the 1980s and 1990s, that allow us to modify the story somewhat. And Personally, I like to modify the story in three main ways. I think there are three aspects of the kind of the commonly presented explanations for the rise of global jihadism that are problematic. It's not that they are wrong. It's just I think they have received perhaps more emphasis than they deserved. Or in one case, it's one factor that has been kind of left out and forgotten. The first one is that I think that the rise of the Afghan Arab movement, and by extension, groups like Al Qaeda, it was less, the work of states than has been than we've tended to argue. So I think some of the accounts, established accounts, are a little bit too state-centric, in that they kind of conflate the explanations for the Afghan jihad as a whole, or for international involvement in the Afghan jihad as a whole, with the specific and much smaller phenomenon of the Afghan Arabs. When you look into the nitty-gritty details of these Afghan Arab networks, when they were when they kind of emerged, in what ways they set up their offices, with what type of money, it's mostly private money and mostly private resources, and with the support of kind of networks and institutions and organizations that are at best semi-state run. And I'm thinking, for example, of the protagonist of my book, Abdallah Azzam, who founded who was the sort of the spiritual father of the Afghan Arabs, and who founded the so-called Services Bureau, which became the main kind of engine of recruitment of Arab foreign fighters to Afghanistan. Now, he was no pawn in a sort of geopolitical game. He was notoriously sort of unpatriotic to any one country. It's because he was a Palestinian refugee. He was something of a vagabond, and he was skeptical of all governments. And there's very little support. There's very little evidence that he received direct support from governments. Instead, he was an academic. He was teaching Islamic law, and he subsisted on a salary from from international Islamic organizations based in Saudi Arabia. That they had some ties to the Saudi state, but they were not the sharp end of kind of Saudi government policy. Nobody in the cabinet in Saudi Arabia decided that Abdullah Azzam should get a salary. So this is this happens at a kind of lower level of analysis, if you will, and so too with many of the other main actors in the kind of Afghan Arab arena. These were often sort of people with an NGO background, or something like that. And so you basically have kind of two things going on in the Afghan jihad. It's a geopolitical game with, yes, intelligence services heavily involved, and then parallel to that, a kind of mostly sort of a private, a non-state scene of transnational Islamists who get involved in the jihad for their own reasons, not because any state is telling them to, or so on. They are genuinely concerned with the cause and want to be involved in it. So I think that this, we probably should tone down the role of states in the emergence of this phenomenon. Secondly, my second sort of claim is that I think the existing explanations have accorded too much importance to the West and to Western foreign policy in the emergence of this phenomenon. Now, again, I'm distinguishing here between the pre-9/11 and the post-9/11 era. And nobody's denying that things like the invasion of Iraq had a major effect on the rise of jihadism. However, I'm talking about the 80s and the 90s, especially about the 80s in this case. There is a widespread view. Now, I'm not sure exactly how widespread it is in more sort of serious academic circles, but certainly sort of on the street, both in the West and in the Middle East, there is a widespread view that it was the US government basically that created Al-Qaeda, or by either directly, some people believe that, or some people might sort of, not necessarily argue that there was direct, CIA, creation of Al-Qaeda, but they will say that, the US funded the Afghan Arabs, or the US sort of was in direct contact with these networks, or that they facilitated the recruitment of Arab fighters to Afghanistan, and so on. I think we can now safely say that's just empirically not the case. There is no evidence of direct US or UK or other Western support directly to Afghan Arabs in the 1980s. And that people have tended, I think, to conflate the Afghan Mujahideen, which did receive a lot of support, with the Arabs. Now, it's reasonable to ask, where does this notion come from then? Why have people been talking about it with so much? And I think there's several factors here. One is that there exist a few, books or art or writings that have basically that have presented this view and purported to present evidence of such direct support, which have turned out not to be true. And one of the most important books in this regard is a book by John Cooley called Unholy Wars, which is full of apparently detailed information about sort of CIA recruitment of Afghan Arabs and so on, but with essentially no footnotes. Or there will be footnotes but the footnote won't have an actual source. And so when you kind of dig, scratch the surface of some of these works that talk about the alleged, Western intelligence support for the Afghan Arabs, scratch below the surface, there's very little there. And I have spent, as you said, 10 years looking into the primary sources of the Afghan Arabs. You would think that, over these thousands of pages of documents from that time, there will be a slight hint of or evidence of kind of such collaboration. There isn't. Instead, there is there are plenty of accounts of kind of hostility toward Westerners, or hostile encounters where some people, some of the Afghan Arabs will talk about how they met and some Western aid workers, and they didn't like that they were there, and they threw some stones at them and swore at them and whatnot. So I think we can safely kind of discount that notion. And relatedly, one of the things I discovered in this project was that the Afghan Arabs were actually very anti-Western already in the 1980s. So, and this to me really pulls the rug under this Gulf War argument that the Afghan Arabs were sort of neutral or just lightly negative to the West in the 1980s, and that it was the Gulf War and the arrival of U.S. troops in the Gulf that kind of changed everything. When you look at the writings of Abdallah Azzam and his magazine Al Jihad in the 1980s, it is chock full of very anti-Western statements, and there at some point in the late 1980s, you get the sense from some of the articles that it's almost like the Afghan Arabs see themselves as being at war with the US more so than the Soviet Union. There's a lot of anti-Americanism well before the Gulf War. And this is, of course, extremely paradoxical, given that the US at this point is supporting the fight to liberate Afghanistan. They're on the exact same side as the Afghan Arabs. And, they are supporting sort of, the liberation of a downtrodden Muslim people more than perhaps any state, any sort of Western state has ever done. And yet, these Afghan Arabs are very, hostile to America and West. And even more paradoxically, they become more anti-Western in the course of the 1980s, just as the Western support for the Afghan Mujahideen increases. It makes no sense, at least to me. But I think it shows one thing, which is that these attitudes are not always correlated with facts on the ground, and that in this case, we're talking about an ideological development inside the movement that was, there were very little relationship with kind of objective facts on the ground. It was basically a kind of a worldview that they developed on their own, inside the movement, and cannot be attributed, I think, to any sort of missteps in Foggy Bottom in Washington. Of course, I'm not saying that the U.S. policy towards Afghanistan in the 1980s was great or perfect or whatever. It had lots of sides and problematic aspects, notably that they supported the more conservative part of the Afghan Mujahideen and so on. But that's another story, and it's another argument from saying that the U.S. created the Afghan Arabs. Finally, my third kind of point, and the third thing that I think has been missing from most accounts, is technology, and the kind of the role of technology in facilitating the emergence of these transnational networks. And it's something sort of tangible and very simple as things like printing technology. That printing becomes cheaper in the 70s and 80s, and more advanced printing technologies, color, the ability to print color photography becomes available to private actors at this time, or that travel becomes cheaper, so it's easier for people to move around and to travel from, say, Australia to Afghanistan or Sweden to Pakistan, much cheaper than it was previously. And couple the two, and you have the ability to ship magazines with color photographs from Afghanistan by air to America and other places. So this globalization is very much, I think, facilitated by technological developments. And of course, from the 1990s onwards, you have perhaps the biggest technological game changer of them all, which is the internet. And we can come back later in the Q&A, perhaps, to the role of the internet in the rise of jihadism after 9/11, but it's big, let me say that. I guess what I'm saying is that sometimes our explanations are have been too focused on the political, and that makes sense, because the people who the people who write books about things like this, they're political scientists, social scientists, so they're interested in politics, like myself. But sometimes I think we can kind of ascribe too much importance to sort of, geopolitical events, or sometimes there are bigger structural forces at work, and I think they work here. I think I'll stop there so we can kind of go more into specific questions that you're interested in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. We have a question. It's rather about, but I think it's basically about the difference between Arabs and non-Arabs in Afghanistan, right? Because so the remark says, but there were Arabs fighting in Afghanistan and they were not supported by the CIA or the US agency.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Is it written in the chat?
Yeah, you can read it there as well.
Yeah, so there were indeed Arabs fighting in Afghanistan, and they were indeed not supported by the CIA or any other US agency. The Arab involvement in Afghanistan, it started as a trickle around around 1980, just after the beginning of the war, but it really started to increase from 1984 onwards. So it's something that happens in the late 1980s, and the curve is kind of grows. So you have the biggest numbers at the very end of the war. In total, in my estimation, somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people traveled to Afghanistan. And I should say that I talk about Afghan Arabs, but that's kind of a shorthand for foreign fighters, and because not all foreign fighters in Afghanistan were Arab. However, the majority were, and the main kind of institutions, networks, and so on were from the Middle East, and Arabic was kind of the lingua franca of this foreign fighter community. But there were Asians, there were white Western converts, there were people from Africa and other places, but it was culturally Arab. And they were not, as I mentioned, they were not supported by Western intelligence agencies. There's no hard evidence for this in any documentary sources. Also, it makes little sense if you think about it, because here you have a war, big strategic war, major kind of frontline in the war, in the Cold War between two superpowers. You have an insurgency with a pretty big force. The Afghan Mujahideen, they're somewhere between 100 and 200,000 soldiers. At the same time, you have this tiny group of foreign fighters. They're never more than 3,000 at one time. But that's including everyone who's also doing support work in Peshawar. In fact, there are good reasons to believe there were never more than 500 fighters on the ground inside Afghanistan proper at any one time. So why would the CIA spend time, given that, bear in mind, they had 3 or 4 people on the ground in Pakistan at this time. Why would they waste time liaising with some of these sort of few hundred guys when there were 150,000 Afghan soldiers that needed support? Also, these Arab foreign fighters, they were not particularly good fighters. They were mostly untrained when they were from the Gulf and so on. So, yeah, there's just no reason why the CIA should create Al-Qaeda or support the Afghan Arabs.
Mm-hmm. All right. So I guess the key point is that they were supporting the Afghan Mujahideen, but not the Arab foreign fighters. So that's I guess the key difference. Okay, so there's this one idea which I would like to come back to perhaps towards the end if we have some more questions on other issues, which is the impact on the invasion in Iraq and how that impacted on the development of global jihad, because I think there, as you suggested already, the argument is a little bit different in terms of the role of the West. But before that, there are a couple of questions, and 2 of them really relate to the fact that, so you said, okay, they were already anti-US, these Arab foreign fighters. Why? Right? And I'm just going to read the questions to you, but I think this is really the gist of both. So one says, you mentioned that the anti-West propaganda was developed in the 80s, but where did this come from? And the second one is, you're saying that Afghan Arabs developed the anti-US, anti-West positions on their own in the 80s, even though their enemy at the time was the Soviet Union, and even though they got financial support from the US. how do you explain that? So basically, I guess it's a bit related.
Yeah, there are two versions of the same question. And I have to say, I don't have a good answer. And I hope to do some more work on this in the future with kind of more sort of textual analysis of Islamist literature in the 70s and 80s to try and trace this in more detail. And obviously, you know, there is anti-Western sentiment in much of the Middle East before the 1990s, obviously, due to the colonial period, and also because in several of the countries that were, you know, that became independent, you know, they had nationalist you know, governments or regimes that, you know, to kind of the champion sort of, you know, national independence and opposed, you know, imperialism and so on, and you know, some countries had, you know, were in the sort of Soviet sphere of influence in the Cold War, and kind of inherited or kind of, you know, were influenced by the sort of anti-US attitudes that comes with that. So and you know, you have the Israeli-Palestinian issue, very thorny, sore point, which which many in the region, you know, see as kind of a, you know, kind of Western station in the region. Even though you could argue that, you know, the amount of sort of direct kind of military support, you know, is quite limited, but it's in the support in the form of money and the form of political support and so on. I think for people in the region, this is perceived often as a semi sort of military foothold in the region. So you have these you know, there's a long kind of tradition, if you will, you know, or element of the political culture, to simplify here, that is, you know, hostile to the US and to the West. But what I find interesting is that you have, even within, you know, within the sort of, you know, given this sort of baseline of sort of skepticism towards the West, you have variation. So that the fact that you have more, what I see in the sources is like, it's basically an increase from a departure even from that baseline of anti-Westernism, of kind of very explicit hostility in the 1980s. Now, one hypothesis I have is that, you know, that this has something to do with sort of the ideological culture or the political culture inside the Muslim Brotherhood. That there is that, you know, there are certain kind of, they have a certain worldview, there are certain truths to sort of their story of how the world is sort of operating, you know, that they don't want to relinquish. They, you know, they have those, they promote those in the 70s and early 80s, and they and it's one where, you know, where the West has kind of always had hostile intentions, and has a history of doing bad things in the region. Therefore, it can never be trusted. It will continue to do bad things. Just look for them and you will find them, so to say. And this was kind of a default position. And so I guess what I'm saying is, you know, I think part of the explanation is simply is mere, you know, ideological prejudice, ideological construction inside a movement. Of course, from elements of truth, from, you know, certain ground truths that you know, but with you know, with, you know, political ideological narratives, something, you know, you can twist things, magnify things, and make, you know, seeming, you know, make things that are actually unrelated seem like they're connected and part of some kind of conspiracy. So for example, you know, you have, you know, Muslim Brotherhood magazines, Al Mujtama magazine, that already in the 1979, 1980s, running front pages with like a cross of David, an American flag, and talks about the Crusaders planning to invade the Gulf. And this is at a point, 1979. This is at a point where there hasn't been any major Western military incursions, certainly not U.S. military incursions in the region for some time. So it's not necessarily correlated with objective facts on the ground. This is a kind of an ideological discourse that kind of lives its own life to some extent. Now, I'm sure that's probably not the whole story, but I think we're dealing here with a situation which is so glaringly disconnected from the facts on the ground. When you have when the U.S. is actually, giving hundreds of $millions to support, the liberation of a Muslim people, and it's doing so, even though the insurgency, the people fighting for that liberation, they're being very religious. They're openly Islamic. They're talking about the struggle as a jihad. So it shows the U.S. was wasn't afraid of Islam as a religion. Wasn't afraid to deal with groups that call themselves jihadists, and they also and then they also materially supported that struggle. Of course, nobody's suggesting that they did it for altruistic reasons. They did it to weaken the Soviet Union, but it's not. But what they did is not particularly sort of conducive to supporting the argument, of the Afghan Arabs and later of Al Qaeda and so on, that the U.S. and the West are involved in a systematic campaign to humiliate and destroy and weaken Muslims around the world. That's where it's there's such a glaring kind of mismatch that we have to look elsewhere for an explanation. Now, of course, again, after 9/11, it's a different story, and it becomes much easier to say that this story, or this sort of Islamist story of a Western assault on Islam, has an objective truth to it.
Okay. I suppose one can also differentiate between, say, anti-Western sentiment in general and actually going as far as to conceive entire campaigns against the West. So that's really quite a qualitative difference. And that's, I suppose, also the question. So what led to this change in strategy to say, like, we're not going to just try to liberate our lands or to just create them as we want, but we're actually going to attack, as they said, the far enemy, and that's I suppose a known switch.
Can I just follow up a little bit on that, because it's quite important. Then I would argue that my argument kind of holds, I think, for the 1990s too, although it's less obvious. Because the U.S. isn't doing quite as much as it did in the 80s to help, Muslim causes. But still, we have the Bosnia War, where the U.S. and the West intervened on the side of the Bosnian Muslims, admittedly late, admittedly sometimes in a bad way, but at the end of the day, it wasn't the U.S. or the West that were killing Bosnian Muslims; it was the Serbs. And similarly, with the deployment of troops to Saudi Arabia in 1990, now the kind of the Islamists in some sense have kind of won the narrative of what happened at that time as by saying that was kind of an occupation of Saudi Arabia. But really, kind of what happened is that what you had a potential assault on a Muslim country, Saudi Arabia, from another Muslim country, and Saudi Arabia called for help. And in fact, at the time, Saudi Arabia issued a call to other Muslim countries that was very kind of religious and kind of and called on people's kind of pan-Islamic solidarities to come and support and defend Saudi Arabia against Saddam's invasion. So, you know, arguably, you know, twisted things a little bit around, and you could frame the U.S. deployment of troops, you know, as something that would defend the the integrity of a Muslim country. It's certainly not. I mean, it's certainly a stretch to say, as bin Laden and many other Islamists did at the time, that this was a military occupation of Saudi Arabia. They were nowhere near the holy sites. They were in bases, military bases in the desert, and so on. So there again, I think we're dealing with an ideological construction of the base of some rather slim kind of facts on the ground. Yeah, so it's just to say that even in the 1990s, the U.S. foreign policy isn't. It's you could say it's bad in the Middle East, but is it really as bad as to suggest, as to kind of explain the hostility of a level that can produce 9/11? To me, it doesn't.
Related to that, there's a comment saying that how about the role of Saudi Arabia refusing bin Laden's help to fight Saddam Hussein and instead accepting the US's help? So how, I mean, what do you think about that kind of explanation? And perhaps also relatedly, for me is there's also the element of local politics. So basically, Osama bin Laden basically being against the regime, and because the regime was supported by the US, therefore being against the US, or at least that's the narrative that circulates.
Yeah, sure. I mean, bin Laden certainly becomes more hostile to the Saudi regime after this, and that's probably part of the background, and that kind of it fits into a much more a very common pattern in Islamist politics in the region, which is hostility to regimes that are seen as insufficiently Islamic. This is the main. Sorry.
In his one of his declarations, he's also, I mean, which was surprising to me, to complain about the lack of human rights and the bad social situation, and the lack of basic facilities. So I think it was more than just, okay, you're not Islamic enough, but he had some actual grievances on the ground that he, of course, interpreted in a certain way. But sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, he was kind of supportive of the demands of the so-called Sahwa movement in Saudi at the time. But speaking of bin Laden specifically, I think his main beef was the presence of U.S. troops and the fact that that the regime allowed it to happen. Now, of course, his alternative to kind of alleged alternative. I'm not sure exactly how good the sources are on this, by the way, but he supposedly proposed to defend Saudi Arabia with a volunteer force consisting, among other things, of ex-Afghan Arabs, but clearly that was not a realistic suggestion. So it wasn't something the regime could accept unless it wanted to be overrun by Saddam's forces. So again, it's sort of a it's something that it kind of explains his trajectory, but it doesn't kind of explain why he was predisposed to interpreting the situation in that sense in the first place. So again, I think and also, it's not like bin Laden was not anti-American before being dismissed by the Saudi king, with this proposal. There's plenty of evidence now that he was hostile, although not in the 1980s, not as hostile as he would later become.
Switching a little bit, we have also a question about Kashmir. So somebody who's familiar, I suppose, with your work asks, as we know, there were many Arab jihadis left in Afghanistan after the Soviet troops withdrawal from Afghanistan, and they had good relations with the so-called Pakistani Kashmiri jihadist groups. Why the Kashmir Jihad cannot attract the Arab jihadists left behind in Afghanistan in the 90s?
Well, I should preface my answer by saying that I'm not a Pakistan specialist. And I think the answer to this lies in Pakistani politics.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's Kashmir is essentially a government-run operation. Although the groups operating there are kind of more or less state-supported, you have militias operating there with the Pakistani ISI's blessing, from the early 1990s onward. If you don't have a major influx of Arab foreign fighters there, I think it's because the ISI, Pakistani authorities didn't want that to happen. They would perhaps lose control of these people and so on. And at the time, the reason the Arabs leave South Asia in the early 90s is not really that conflict ends in Afghanistan. It's that the Pakistanis throw them out. Conflict does, of course, end in some sense. I mean, the Russians withdraw in February 1989, and at that point, for the rest of 1989, some people go home and they kind of leave the jihad, but some people continue to fight, and there are some new people who arrive who don't care that the Russians have gone, but who want to fight the Afghan communists in Kabul, and they do so until that regime falls in early 1992. And then conflict continues in Afghanistan because there's infighting between the Mujahideen parties. But in 1992, Pakistan kind of has enough and sort of basically tells the Arab community in Peshawar to pack up and leave, basically. I think that's why, basically. That's why the Pakistan wasn't inclined to have Arab foreign fighters on their territory, and that's why they didn't kind of invite them to Kashmir. Now, there have been some Arab foreign fighters in Kashmir over the years, but just trickles. But I think the answer lies in kind of the state-led nature of the Islamist violence in Kashmir.
All right. And one from somebody who has read your book, and he says, the book in the first chapters highlights the diatribe between left-wing Palestinian fighters and Islamists. How did the Afghan jihad affect this diatribe?
Yeah. Good question, and thanks for picking up the book and reading it so carefully. It's as the questioner suggests, the sort of culture war between the left and the Islamists in the 60s and 70s is very important. And again, this kind of illustrates the extent to which the anti-Westernism increases in the 1980s, because if you look at the things Islamists write about in the 60s and 70s, they're more focused on kind of the left, the secular Arab left or Palestinian left, than they are about the West. And for the protagonist of the book, Abdallah Azzam, this is a big issue. I mean, he's furious with the Palestinian left, because he feels, as an Islamist Palestinian, that the secular leftists have hijacked the cause. In the 1980s, the discourse changes somewhat. I mean, so Abdallah Azzam doesn't. I mean, he's obviously very hostile to the communists because he's kind of he's involved in a fight against them. But his writings don't, in his writings it doesn't linger in as much. It doesn't linger as much on the evils of communism as he did before. So he wrote a book called The Red Cancer and other diatribes against communism before the Afghan Jihad. But during the Afghan Jihad, when he's actually fighting them, he doesn't really do that. So it could be that, he considers that his views on communism are well known. It takes for granted that people, know that he is anti-communist, but at least it's not a preoccupation of his. And so my sense is that this sort of conflict line fades a little bit, and I think it is because it's being replaced by something else, and that is pan-Islamism, another type of sort of worldview which is more concerned with sort of threats to the Muslim community, the international Muslim community, from the outside, from non-Muslims. So, in some sense, the fight with the leftists is in some sense is an internal fault line, of the same type as the fault line between Islamists and regimes, Muslim, nominally Muslim regimes like that in Egypt or in Syria. These are kind of they're fights inside the Ummah or the Middle East, and then but then later in the 1980s and onwards, many Islamists, not all, but many Islamists become more focused on these sort of outside enemies, the non not sort of the West, the Soviet Union in Afghanistan and so on, than they are with the sort of internal enemy. Yeah.
Okay. I have an earlier question inquiring into the role of Iran in supporting Al-Qaeda. I don't know if you want to address that. And then afterwards, I'd like to go further, more towards the present, because there was also a question about, so how do we get from there, where you just told us, to the current terrorist attacks that we have in Europe? What happened in the meantime? How can we understand this evolution briefly?
Yeah. So the important thing to understand is that, as far as Europe is concerned, is that what happens in Europe is not so much kind of dictated by some masterminds in Afghanistan, dictated by Bin Laden in the 90s or 2000s, nor is it dictated by the leader of Islamic State somewhere in Syria or Iraq, because we have, from the mid-90s onwards, an indigenous, locally embedded community of very radical Islamists. This community, so question, and where does that community come from? Well, the short story of it is that it was sort of founded by kind of already mobilized activists from the Muslim world, primarily from Algeria, from Egypt, and other places. People, notably, GIA members who sought political asylum in the UK, France, and Belgium, and other places in the early 90s, and who kind of sort of, to some extent, sort of imported some of this. Some of these ideas and attitudes to Europe, and they became kind of the starting point, or the seeds of the growth of a larger radical Sunni Islamist scene in Europe. But by the late 90s, you already have kind of a scene of militants in Europe that is kind of that are local, consisting of people who've lived in Europe for a long time or even born there, and and this scene will just continue to grow over the years, and it will consist of people who were born and bred, or at least bred in Europe, but who are part of a kind of this ideological movement. And now, why does it grow? Why does it become bigger in the 2000s and 2010s? Many reasons, many factors. One is the polarization triggered by the 9/11 attacks. So in the 9/11 attacks, and I like to sort of start there, because many people say the war on terror causes this, but we mustn't forget that the war on terror wouldn't have been there without the attack on 9/11. So it triggers a dynamic of kind of a vicious circle of violence, with clearly over kind of excessive kind of countermeasures from the US and Western side, increased Islamophobia, a sense of persecution, of discrimination, and so on, among Muslims in the West, anger among Muslims in the West over these military adventures in the region, and an associated sort of desire to do something about that, to avenge it, and so on. But also, it's not just foreign policy. It's also the internet, which allows for radical ideas, radical interpretations of what's going on in the world to be disseminated on a large scale. So to the 2000s, from around 2000 onwards, the amount of online propaganda increases a lot, and you get the ability to distribute videos and imagery and so on a much larger scale than before. And I think this is very important in kind of in fueling and keeping this movement alive. And later in the 2010s, the internet becomes even more important, because around in the late 2000s you get new platforms, new types of technologies, like social media in particular, that just provide propaganda distributors with enormously, with vastly improved capabilities. It becomes possible to disseminate propaganda on a much larger scale than before. And then on top of that, you get a major kind of crisis in the Middle East in the form of the Syria war. Right at the same time, so you get a big, real political conflict where a lot of people are actually suffering, where there are real people being killed, women and children being killed, and there are photos of this, and this material, this photos goes into this big new propaganda distribution machine that is the internet, and just is able to reach many more people than would have been reached by a similar conflict in the past. And so very radical groups are able to exploit these technologies to get more young people on board with their particular interpretation of what's going on, and so on, and hence the wave of foreign fighters, etc., etc. And then there are further dynamics to be discussed here. The role. There is also a role here for organizations. I mentioned before that we sometimes overestimate the role of Al-Qaeda Central or IS Central, but there is a role for them too. I mean, the wave of attacks in Europe in 2015 and 2016 was probably the product of, initially at least, of an order of a strategy, a deliberate strategy from Islamic State to send people and to encourage people to attack in the West with high frequency. So lots of factors and different factors come into play at different times, but the bottom line is that, from the 90s, there is a community, a transnational community of activists on the ground, and they they get kind of ideological nourishment from actual conflicts in the Middle East, and they use technology to mobilize on the basis of these political developments.
So you basically did, in a nutshell, summary of what happened after 9/11. I was just wondering if you could zoom in what we said before, the effect of the Iraq invasion, and which eventually led to the birth of IS, and how the IS is different or not to Al-Qaeda.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the Iraq invasion, I'm kicking in open doors when I'm saying that it was a bad foreign policy step, and to say it's a bad foreign policy step is an enormous kind of
understatement.
Understatement. In fact, I mean, in terms of the rise of jihadism, I think it's perhaps even a bigger mistake than we've tended to realize. It's a spectacularly fateful decision. The other day I was going back, looking at just some data of things, and I was looking at terrorism data from the so-called Global Terrorism Database. And I noticed that the quietest years in recorded history, terrorism-wise, are the years 1998 to 2002. So in this period, that's the bottom of this fluctuating curve of terrorist attacks around the world. So, and then it just skyrockets the year that the US invaded Iraq. Also, a while ago, I looked at some other data. I wanted to know, and I'm hopefully going to publish this at some point. I want to study the actual, metrics for Western military presence in the Middle East over the years, to see whether given that jihadists talk so much about Western military presence in the region, to see whether there is a statistical correlation between how many Western troops are in the Muslim world at any one time and how much violence you get that year or the next. And I was just looking at the data, and the numbers of kind of troops, Western troops in the Muslim world, are actually relatively low in the very beginning of the 2000s, and they later decline, and nowadays they're relatively low, lower than, in fact, in the 1990s if you look at all of the Muslim world. But something, the curve just skyrockets in 2003, and you go from, I think it is something like an aggregated 5,000 to 10,000 troops all over the Muslim world to 100,000. And it remains very high until and it goes down slowly, steady, during the Obama years, and then it's kind of, it plateaus at a lower level. So the Iraq War really did bring in, objectively speaking, a massive military presence, and obviously I'm just talking here about the the effect on jihadism. I'm not even just talking about the toll it had on Iraqi civilian population and all the rest, which is more important than the evolution of jihadism later on. But anyway, that's what we're talking about here, and I really wonder sometimes what history would have looked like without the invasion of Iraq. If if there had been just a more targeted kind of anti-Al-Qaeda strategy in Afghanistan and the border areas, in the 2000s, things could have looked more differently. Now, I think there are structural factors that might have caused something, might have caused an increase anyway, such as the rise of social media. Maybe if we didn't have the Iraq War, maybe the violence, a conflict would have erupted somewhere else in the region 5, 10, 15 years later, due to the pressure and the fragility, internal pressures in many Muslim countries or Middle Eastern countries, and the fragility of some of these regimes. It could have had a war, a civil war in Syria or some other country for other reasons, and maybe that war would have become a kind of crucible for another ISIS, or an ISIS of a parallel universe. It's possible, but not necessary. So yeah, Iraq War, just truly spectacularly bad and fateful event for the history of jihadism. And in fact, let me add also that one thing is that the objective effect it had, like on the phenomenon. Another thing is the effect it's had on the discourse on terrorism in subsequent years. It's really polluted the discourse on kind of what to do with terrorist groups, because it's kind of it's made it such that if you are ever in favor of military or something tangibly slightly sort of heavy-handed approach to a terrorist group, then the conversation immediately steered towards sort of the Iraq War, global war on terror, excess, etc. Even though in some cases, there might be an argument in certain situations for using force against, in a limited way against certain types of actors, simply because there are, small groups out there that won't yield to, diplomacy, or that won't be affected by broader, shifts in economic policy or things like that. They're an acute and, just very threatening actor, but the whole discussion about what to do in those situations is affected by the legacy of the Iraq War, and to get more kind of parochial, it's also, I think, affected the way the academic study of terrorism and jihadism is perceived, and is perceived by some in the academy. To even study these things is seen by some as, kind of morally compromised in some way, that you are then kind of implicitly on board with the war on terror and all that it stands for, including the Iraq War. So there's something really pernicious about the Iraq War in that respect as well, that I think has, sometimes prevents us from finding the best solutions.
All right, we're actually at the end of it, but I just wanted to perhaps in 1 minute insist on the question IS versus Al-Qaeda. Are we dealing with a different kind of organization? Was there a breach in between? Is the founder of IS, in a sense, and the kind of life that he had as compared to, for example, Azzam, right? Does that influence the type of organization that eventually emerged? I mean, al-Zarqawi, that's what it's him I'm referring to.
Yeah. Well, I think it's, you know, it's probably too early to say. I think we need more years to think about this and digest this. But um, my sense is that they do represent different phenomena in some sense, but and in some sense not. I mean, they're both very similar and very different. If you understand me, so on, in one sense, in terms of sort of if you ask senior IS and Al Qaeda leader about their kind of their vision for the future and kind of the what type of society they want, I think they won't be that different. I think both want an Islamic state, a very strict and rigid Islamic state. They're both willing to use violence. They're both extremely anti-Western, although they might not always focus resources in that direction. So in terms of sort of stated objectives, in terms of the kind of the doctrines, they're not. I mean, there are differences, yes, but they're not huge. They're not like the difference between, other kind of, not like the difference between Al Qaeda and Hamas or IS and the Taliban, or let alone other more far-flung actors. So the doctrinal differences are negligible, but I at least see major difference in the kind of the sociology of it, in the sense that well, in several ways. One, just in terms of age, my sense is that the IS phenomenon is to some extent a generational rebellion, youth rebellion inside the jihadi movement. It's not to say that all IS fighters are old. Many of these leaders are old, but it was clear, I think, in 2014, when IS was declared, or the caliphate was declared, that there was a generational gap, that lots of younger sort of the young anonymous masters who kind of went aboard with IS, and many of these sort of older hands in the jihadi movement were were reluctant to go with them and supported Al Qaeda. And the culture inside the groups is slightly different. In IS, there is a different. There's a more. It's kind of more vulgar in a sense. They're less interested in sort of what we call sort of jihadi high culture. That they do a lot more of these gory videos of beheadings and kind of creative torture methods and so on. And it's just for lack of a better word, I mean, it's kind of a more populist or sort of commercial, kind of lowbrow version of activism than Al Qaeda, which kind of has tended to present itself as a sort of an elite thing, that is doctrinally elaborate. Look at all these books, and they will sort of produce a lot of books and have detailed ideological discussions, and they have leaders and thinkers who are old and have written many books, and it's sort of an exclusive thing also, kind of in terms of membership, and whereas IS was kind of more open doors. So for these and other reasons, they're sociologically, sociologically different. And I think in the case of IS, there is a substantial kind of Iraq element here, and we can see the effects of the fact that some senior some IS cadres have a background from the Ba'athist regime in Iraq. They have different skills. They have perhaps a slightly more secular view on certain things, although, you know, the sort of, I think academics haven't still figured out just exactly how big the kind of the Ba'athist role in the rise of IS was, but it's there in some scale or other. So yeah, and my concern, I mean, what I'm kind of looking out for now is not only kind of the relationship between these two sort of main brands in the landscape, but also for kind of new organizations or new. Because I mean, I would expect there to be a certain sort of trickling off of support from IS due to their losses and so on, and for them too to suffer a sort of a generational rebellion to some extent. Although I think IS will survive as an ideological phenomenon for a long time. I wouldn't be surprised if we see in 5 or 10 years and another phenomenon that will be different from both Al Qaeda and IS in some way or other. I don't know what exactly it would be, but that will try to cast itself as the new and hottest thing in sort of and for people who want to fight for Islam.
Well, thank you so much for this overview. It's a really tough in 1 hour and a half to talk about the whole history of global jihad. But yeah, thanks a lot. And I wholeheartedly recommend your book, which is extremely detailed and full of evidence for everything which is in there. I will come back to you with 2 questions that I have noted down. But in the interest of time, and again, thanks a lot to all the participants, and we will keep you informed. We will keep on producing evidence-based analysis on terrorism and jihadism, because I think we need it now more than ever. So thanks again, and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Bye-bye.
Bye.